Fundamentally, the narrow Brexit majority represented a rejection of strong rule-based cooperation between states. It asserted a narrow vision of sovereignty, which developed in the 19th century and directly led to the two bloodiest wars in history. Let there be no doubt about where Ireland stands. We want nothing to do with a backward-looking idea of sovereignty.
Oh, well, everybody's heard about the bird. The bird, bird, bird. The bird's a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Bird is a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. The bird's a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a winner. Well, a bird, bird. The bird's a winner. Well, a bird, bird, bird. The bird's a winner. Well, a bird.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we're recording now. So thanks everybody. Thanks for joining, or thanks for listening in. And basically what I wanted to talk about today was, so the thing I wanted to talk about today was, it's basically an extension of what I was talking about last time. So I was talking last time about, you know, the RIP data, the impact of the vaccines, ADE, and all the kind of circumstantial evidence to show that it was the vaccine that was causing this and causing all these issues, rather than, say, you know, an issue with the hospitals or hospital capacity or the actual virus itself. But also, when I kind of finished up on that one, I was talking about the impact of how the Irish elites, or how certain people high up within Irish society, are going to react to all of this, and the increased amount of hysteria that's kind of going on right now as well. You know, with the whole Ashton Murphy and the vigils of thousands and thousands of people all around the state. So I kind of wanted to build on that and talk about, like, what kind of led us into this position. In other words, what the people making the decisions on this, especially within the Irish context, how did they end up there? Why are they making these decisions? Because, you know, a lot of what's happened is because of these, you know, you've got these unaccountable civil servants, you've got these unaccountable politicians to a degree, and you've got these unaccountable journalists. So I'm going to talk about the structure that put that in place, because the thing is, like, you know, I think everyone here is fairly kind of aware of the, you know, things like the World Economic Forum and the WHO and all that kind of thing, and their influence. But at the same time, you know, even if people like this or someone like this has a plan, you still need people to, you know, pull it off or work in your favor or in your interest. Because, you know, in that way, it's kind of like running a company. Like, you know, you could be a CEO, and you're trying to make your profit, or you're trying to get your business kind of up there, for lack of a better phrase. But if you don't have the people to implement it or pull it off, or if you don't have people that are in line with it, then it's just going to fall apart. So I want to talk about, like, how Irish society, or how Ireland chooses its elites. How does someone like Micheál Martin end up as Taoiseach? How does Gavin Riley end up as a presenter on Virgin Media? How does all of this work? Because I think, and with that, I think it can be used to predict how these people, these politicians, these civil servants, these journalists are going to react to future events. Because there's a lot of very, very interesting and a lot of very, very serious stuff come down the line. You know, we've got inflation, we've got we've got the impact on supply lines, we've got all of these different things. But, and even then, like, you know, there's, you know, you hear kind of some people talk about, like, you know, oh, this is over, or, you know, or the conspiracy theorists are, you know, they're wrong again, that kind of thing. You know, obviously look at Canada or what's going on in Austria right now. But one of the problems that's led to all of this is the way that Irish society chooses elites. because what's happened over the past, especially like 10 years, but it goes back even further than that, is that our elites, or the system that select for elites, relies increasingly on compliance at the expense of absolutely everything else. And what that ultimately leads to is high up people within your media, within your civil service, within your government, and increasingly within your corporations, who are not there because they're natural leaders, who are not there because they're the most intelligent, who are not there because they're the most charismatic, but they're there because of all of our kind of main systems and institutions, and yeah, pretty much all of them, selecting for nothing but compliance. So I'm just going to talk about kind of like how exactly that's done. So the first thing is, and also I'm going to focus mainly on kind of an Irish case or an Irish example. So the first thing is, like, you know, if you take a look at America, like, or anything like that, you know, you have your Harvards and your Princetons, and you know, you have these centers of, you know, the elites. Your elites end up in there. You know, in the UK, it's Cambridge and Oxford. In Ireland, it's Trinity and UCD. And on a lower level, it's some of the schools like in your South County Dublin schools like Mount Anville, Clongowes, Blackrock. In some of in like Cork, it would be, someone can, you know, someone can correct me here, but I think it's Christians and Pres. You know, you have these kind of lower level kind of secondary schools which also select for this. So, you know, Ireland, like in that way, is no different to other countries. It may be more kind of centralized in that way, like, you know, it's clearly UCD or Trinity, and then if you kind of go down to your lower level schools, but it's still, that still exists. And the issue with that is, for various reasons, if so, for various reasons, if you end up in, well, actually, no, let me just roll it back a bit. If you take a look at, say, what exactly is being meant, or what exactly is being said by the definition of, you know, like far right. What's far right? Well, far right, what might have actually meant something proper like 10 years ago or whatever, you know, more right wing on average. But far right these days is essentially just turned into a statement whereby if you are against the regime, or if you are against the establishment in any shape or form, if you disagree with them, rather, not maybe even against them, if you just disagree with them on one single point, then you're far right. It's like the way that, like, you know, if you go on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, and if you see someone talk about their pronouns, you know, she, him, or him, her, or they, them, the point of that is just simply a signal to other people, you know, subconsciously done, more than likely, to show to other people, I am fully on board and I'm fully in agreement with everything the regime does and the regime says. So why is that important? So roll it back. Let's just kind of just bring it back even as far back as, like, say, secondary school. So you've got this highly compliant, highly, you know, regularized system, which, you know, selects for compliance, selects for complacency, and it starts filter. You know, the system starts filtering out people all the way through from that. So, you know, you might ask the question, or, you know, someone might ask the question, why am I doing this? Why am I learning algebra? Or why am I learning, you know, CSE? Or, you know, what's the point of this? And so the system starts from that point selecting people out more and more as things go on. And this goes into every single facet or of Irish society, to pretty much. I mean, for example, let's just take, you're in university, or you end up in university, and you end up in the Sinn Féin, I don't know, political party meeting, right? If you say anything that's remotely, you know, non-left, I mean, I think I could reference two kind of pretty good recent examples of people. Say, the guy who it's gone on my name. Oh, yeah. The guy who co-wrote Father Ted, Graham Linehan. Graham Linehan has been on board with pretty much he's just a lefty, I suppose, and he's on board with pretty much everything apart from one thing, and that's the whole kind of transsexual stuff, quite rightly. And the fact that he's been on board with the regime for everything but this one thing, he's been booted out. He's now far right. He's now a transphobe. So he's been kicked out of the system to that degree. Or another person I can think of is to some degree, is the sports journalist, Ewan McKenna. Like, again, on board with everything, this, that, and the other. But then he had the audacity to say, well, lockdowns are a bit much and vaccines shouldn't be mandatory. And then his fellow journalists start smearing him, and in chat groups, and calling him far right, and how you'll never write for this paper and this organization. He's talked about this before himself, but it's an increased system that, like, it's an increased mechanism that over the past 10 years, especially since the Fine Gael government have come in, the elites increasingly select for this utter complacency. So if you're a natural leader, you end up getting kicked out of the system, or you end up getting kicked out of the group. Because what happens with natural leaders, and what's happened especially over the past 10 to 20 years, is that you had an increased amount of, and this would be, say, like a university example, but it also expands out to kind of a work example or a corporate example. You've had increased amounts of women in your places of work, in academia, all of that kind of thing. Now, that's a product of two things. One thing that's a product of is the shift over in your economy and your workforce to a working in an office, technical. There isn't there's less kind of physical constraints in terms of you working in those environments, and so because of that, more women are able to enter, on top of the encouragement of women entering the workforce, the 60s and whatnot onwards. And the other thing as well is the increased amount of immigration into Ireland. So when you have that in your workforce, when you have that in your academia, when you have that in all your organizations, you're more and more selecting for you're more and more selecting for compliance, because you've got more and more people who could be potentially offended by something because of the increased amount of new nationalities within your organization, and because women tend to be more kind of go along to get along. Everyone is kind of treated fairly and all that kind of thing. You have this effect whereby your organizations are increasingly selecting for this compliance, for this go along to get along, and anyone who's, say, maybe more of a kind of a natural leader type gets kicked out of it because of that reason. And another thing to people who would tend to get kicked out of these kind of groups would be, say, creative people, because creative people tend to be, if you're kind of creative, you're more likely inclined to try new things, look at new things, read new things, say new things. And when you tend to go down that route, you tend to make more mistakes. When you tend to make more mistakes, you risk being more and more booted out of these organizations. And the other thing too is that, as people like Edward Dutton have talked about this, and how has the West essentially kind of innovated in terms of scientific progress or engineering progress or anything like that. And it's through the role of these geniuses, these genius types that crop up now and again, and you let them kind of go, and they come up with a brand new innovation, a brand new tool. But the problem is that geniuses can tend to be kind of maybe strange or autistic, or they tend to weird out, or they tend to alienate people who they tend to alienate kind of normal people. And so they end up getting kicked out, and they end up not driving any innovation within group or cohort anymore. So ultimately, you're left with the most compliant, the most kind of clean people, and you're also left with even people who are kind of more aware of what they need to get ahead of the system. So you're also selecting for even kind of an increased amount of psychopaths, basically. And finally, there's another couple of components as well on top of that within those systems is loyalty. And the way and loyalty kind of comes in two components. So I'll talk about them in two different ways now. So the first way that loyalty is generated through a lot of these groups is through basically sending too many people, especially within the middle class and the upper middle class, sending too many people to university. And this works in two ways. So the first way it works is there's simply too many people going to university. And because there's too many people going to university, there are too many people, like there's a name for it. I think maybe Keith Woods might have said something. He called it elite overproduction, but you know what I mean. It's basically too many people who think they should be there, or they're capable of being in charge or being one of the elites. They think that they should be there, but they're not there, and they think it's kind of like, oh well, I'm smart because I got my degree in philosophy or anything or something like that. So because of that, they have their own increased kind of loyalty to the system, and that kind of goes back to like the whole kind of like almost in a sense kind of buttering up with like elite overproduction is, oh okay, cool, no, that's fair enough. Okay, so it's Angela Nagel's term according to Matthew. Yep, cool, that's great. And then the second one is that the thing is, it's kind of maybe a simple thing, but like if you're talking about maybe something like confidence, right? How do you get confidence? Well, one way to gain confidence is to get good at something. You get good at a trade, or you get good at, I don't know, programming, or you get good at painting, or whatever. The problem is when you start dumbing down your university system, and when more and more people start going into your university system, not only do they are more attached to the idea of feeling like elites because you've thrown a degree their way, you've also taught them absolutely no skills. So because you've taught them no skills, what are they going to do? They enter the workforce, they enter the labor market. What are they going to do? They can't, they can't do a trade, or they can't do mathematics, or whatever it might be. And so because of that, they're increasingly reliant on being loyal and supporting the system, compared to say someone who is really really competent or has a really really good skill set. Because competent people have options. Competent people can walk away. Competent people can make demands of people and of employers and what that kind of thing. And competent people can afford to let things kind of, maybe in a sense, kind of fall apart. But if you're training these people to almost kind of be essentially, in a sense, incompetent, they have nothing else to do but essentially to be loyal to the system at hand. And so that just creates this, and this feeds up throughout the whole system. So if you end up in politics, if you end up in one of these groups, if you end up in the Fianna Fáil, the Young Fianna Fáil, or the Young Fine Gael party, you're not allowed to say anything outside of what's accepted, because you'll get kicked out of the system. Creative people get kicked out of the system. Natural leaders get kicked out of the system, and everyone is more and more likely to go along with it because they essentially have to go along with it. And then there's the other component of something like I've talked about this before, the theory of biological Leninism. So what you end up with is, it's a great theory because it explains a lot on how people who are very, very obsessed with a lot of this kind of left-wing stuff, left-wing politics, why they act the way that they do. Why is it, for example, that some feminists will talk about, men acting badly, but then they won't call out men acting badly in Rotterdam, sorry, yeah, Rotterdam. So that kind of thing. So it creates even more laws to the system, because if you have someone like, maybe someone who just hasn't been born in a good position or a lucky position in life, then you can kind of just go to them and go, hey, this is a very, very left-wing system, or the reason, you're not doing well in life is not because, uh, you're ugly, or you have a bad personality, or you're not that talented, or you're not that smart. It's because of this, system, whether it's the patriarchy, or whether it's people being racist towards you, or anything like that. And so that's another so it's another mechanism that drives people a lot towards left-wing politics. I mean, that's not all people who get into this stuff. I mean, some people, like I said before, they're just, like the people who have she, her in their pronouns to symbolize, or to show that they're, they're loyal to the system. So it's not like that all the time, but it is certainly like that a lot of the time. So where does that lead to? Well, that leads to a number of different places. First of all, that ends up everywhere. That ends up you'll find that in academia. So, the kind of geniusy kind of guy gets kicked out, and then you end up with a system that ultimately selects for, like you could be in a science, or you could be in a physics department, and you could be like in an economics department, and you want to say, I don't know, this is maybe a basic example, look at some unorthodox economics, or you could be in the climate analysis meteorological department. You could be kind of like, well, I don't necessarily think climate change is that big a deal. You'll be gone. You'll be gone. There'll be no funding in it for you. There'll be no welcome grant. There'll be no, if you're a journalist, Simon Cumbers Fund. All of that is gone. All of that is gone. So ultimately what happens is, over time, your system just ends up filtering out the anyone who does not select for compliance. And you can even see this a bit in the media. I mean, obviously everyone here knows John Waters. I mean, John Waters is just a normal mainstream media journalist, and then he gets kicked out 2014, 2015. Kevin Myers gets kicked out as well for for a certain comment, which I'm not going to maybe talk about here, but that's what you ultimately end up with. You end up with an absolutely complacent, compliant, go along to get along leadership, and that's going to lead to a number of. There's going to be another couple of responses on top of that. So one response on top of that is, if it's getting to the stage now whereby, because of the increased amount of hysteria that's going on within Irish society, because whether it's things like Ashton Murphy, or whether it's the whole coronavirus lockdown issues, we're getting to the stage whereby, if you disagree with any of the regime's points, it's not just the fact that you disagree with them, it's you're automatically far right. And this has an enormous amount of very, very troubling ramifications. So one of them is that, in terms of decision making from a civil servant government point of view, they are only able to think in this very, very narrow manner. So, for example, if we wanted to talk about the housing issue, or the housing crisis, right? So, you'll hear a Pierce Doherty, or you'll hear Owen O'Brien talking about this kind of stuff, and imagine, or any of the kind of regime economists, and imagine you were to just bring up the fact that Since between 2015 and 2020, net migration to Ireland, according to the CSO figures, increased by 150,000. Now, 150,000 in the space of those 4 or 5 years, assuming 4 of them per house, um, 4 of them kind of having a house share, but even then, you're talking about issues like, you know, the a big chunk of them are going to want to live in Cork, Dublin, Galway. They're not going to want to live in, say, Leitrim, or out in the country or anything like that. So when you talk about it like that, and you talk about the demand side, you are automatically shut down and smeared as being, a racist. You're a racist, and you hateful coming here, even though it's just a simple iron law of economics that more people come into your country, more people have a demand for goods and services, and more people have a demand for housing. So that kind of disagreement means anything which goes against this compliance is seen on the regime as a form of essentially attack. And that is leading into, say, what you're seeing in Canada right now. Because with the whole Canadian thing, you have this, like Justin Trudeau, or you have this kind of elite who have their own opinions because the system is selected for compliance. And also the circles that they mix in has rendered them essentially like not as aware of issues that affect kind of, older people or rural people. But not only that, they see themselves as the ones with the automatic, they have the right way of thinking. This is the right way forward. We trust the science. We are progressive. Work our way through. We work our way forward through problems like this. And the problem like that is they don't see a disagreement of any of their points or any of their policies in the same way that, you might or I might. They see it as an actual attack on themselves. So, like, we've got the best philosophy. Why are you attacking this philosophy that I have? Or, we have I've been selecting for, I've been trying to get along with the science and, what the experts say. And then suddenly these honkers turn up in Ottawa, and the laptop class people can't get any sleep there, and the far right Americans are investing them. And so they melt down. They start melting down. And it ends up in a back and forth tit for tat, whereby the government doubles down, and then people end up striking back, and then the government doubles down even more, and then the process just repeats itself and repeats itself until eventually you end up in this kind of authoritarian system or authoritarian framework. So with that, it's going to be very, very hard, and it's going to be very, very difficult for these people to admit that they are wrong. And it's because of their world philosophy, and it's because of the way and the manner that they've been selected for. So in terms of the Canada stuff, I think it's going to come down almost kind of fairly cleanly, kind of one side or the other. Either Trudeau has to go, I would say, kind of fairly authoritarian to deal with this, or he just caves in and he just gives in to the truckers, because they're not going to admit that they're wrong. And furthermore as well, if the trucker thing collapses, what's going to happen is going to be the Canadian equivalent of January the 6th. So you're going to have like truckers, I would, get arrested or being prosecuted for, trying to take down the system or kind of rebel against the system in that way. I could definitely, or if that doesn't happen, that's at least going to be bid up to happen so that they can have their own, January the 6th insurrection moment. Although, the insurrection stuff in the US was hardly insurrection to say the least. So that's the kind of policy that's working back and forth there. And it goes into our policy back and forth too, because the problem with the coronavirus as well is that it's selecting for even kind of people, kind of younger people coming up, it's selecting for even more complacency. So you have to go along with everything now. It's not just enough for you to go along with, a lot of LGBT stuff, or, well, I mean, when I say LGBT stuff, you know what I mean. You have to go along with absolutely everything, and you have to go along with the lockdowns, and that the lockdowns make sense, and that the vaccine works, and we'd be in a much worse place if it wasn't for the vaccine. You have to go along with absolutely everything now. And what happens is that the more you select for this compliance, and because of this extra compliance with the lockdowns, the increasingly there's an increasingly limited amount of ways or creative ways you can think on how to deal with a problem. And so this loops back into the inflation and the supply chain and the cost of living stuff right now. So just like the housing stuff, it's not really going to be solved because the plans or the solutions are going to be put forward. They're going to be a combination of, let's throw people money, or let's give people, I think one of the more ridiculous ones you're seeing is, like, let's give people an energy credit. But obviously, of course, if you give everyone an energy credit, that's just spreading the same amount out into the money supply. So that'll end up with a corresponding increase in inflation. And there's other ones as well, like, let's just raise everyone's wage. But of course, if you raise everyone's wage, you're just going to get a corresponding rise in price, and you're going to have a corresponding effect whereby people who work, people who might get hired for a job or whatever, those certain costs go up as well. And so those people get kicked out of, like, being hired from a business or being hired for a job. So all of that is building up. And the other proportion or component of that as well is that you have, I'll go into Sinn Féin in a bit, but you basically have just this absolutely rigid elite who, quite frankly, seem to dislike a lot of Irish people, or dislike the average Irish person, with this absolutely embedded compliant philosophy that they can do no wrong, and they can't, not only can do no wrong, they can't think outside it. They can't think, when they're dealing with the housing crisis, they can't think about the demand side of the equation. They can only think in the supply. And so what does this mean? It means, like, if we get a thunderstorm, it's going to be, more climate. This is the result of climate change. We must deal with that accordingly. If it's like the Ashley Murphy thing, this is the result of men being evil, and we must deal with that accordingly. If if there's another kind of, coof, this is an emergency, we need to deal with that accordingly. There's going to be an increasingly short list of decisions or abilities to make those decisions. And so what that's ultimately going to end up in is some form of collapse, because when you have people making these increasingly ridiculous decisions, just things just stop working. And this is compounded by a couple of things that I posted about it a couple of days ago on the Telegram channel. It was Tooltide. He was talking about, he put a post together about and people like Edward Dutton have talked about this too, the decline in intelligence that has occurred, especially in the West, but worldwide in general, since the mid 1800s. And stuff that's accredited or marked on includes like, you know, the uh, the decreased amount of innovations, the vocabulary and the dumbing down of people's vocabulary, the reduction in people's reaction times, because reaction times are a very, very strong proxy or a very strong correlate with IQ, and the amount of genes that are kind of that are predicted in the role of predicting IQ that have been gradually declining within the population over time. I'm just giving a very kind of rough summary of it, but it's another effect or it's another impact which is going to hit us and hit our decision abilities to make decisions or our leads to make decisions further and further and further. And there there is a lot there's a lot of there's a few Truder says, yeah, cool. Have a good one, Truder. So there's also a number of there is a bit more to that though. I mean, because one of the things is that if you've got all these kind of compliant people and the non-compliant people are getting kicked out of these systems, these organizations, well, those people haven't gone away. And so this is where people like, I mean, journalism is a good example. This is where people like, you know, Dave Cullen come into things. These people may have been kicked out of the system, but they're not going anywhere. And with these kind of things, people respect and people like people who are competent and who are good at their jobs and who are good at predicting things. And in the case of that, you know, I mean, like it's just kind of funny or remarkable, you know, like you know, you see someone like Fintan O'Toole who's been consistently wrong on everything pretty much, and then you have someone like Dave Cullen who called this correctly right from the start, and who has been consistently correct right from the start. So, and that's also another important point, because if you start kicking out these kind of like natural leaders or creative people or non-compliant people out of the system, the other thing too is, and I'm sure everyone has seen it, you know, like in working themselves, that there's usually like one or two people who are like exceptionally good at their jobs. And then there's maybe one or two people who are like absolutely terrible at their jobs and they're surviving for whatever reason. And then everyone else is just kind of like uh kind of average or whatever. Like there's a particular rule for this. It's I forget the name of the guy exactly. I think it's like Powers Law or whatever, but basically um it's a sort of a proxy for like productivity in a company. So it basically goes along the lines of like the square root of the amount of employees in your company tend to be responsible for about 50% of the economic output in that company. So if you've got like 10, you know, if you've got like 9 people in your company, you know, the square root of 9 is 3. So those 3 people are responsible for 50% of the company's output. If you've got, and that ends up scaling up very, very quickly. So if you've got um like 100 people, you know, like 10 people are responsible for 50%. So what I mean by that is if you Price's Law, thank you, Matthew. Yeah, I'm really bad in names tonight. Yeah, Price's Law, not Powers Law. What am I saying? Power Law is an actual mathematical thing or issue. Yeah, Price's Law. So it's not just that you're kicking out a few people, it's that you're kicking out extremely competent people who can massively outperform other people. So, I mean, another example of this is take a look at, I mean, I don't know anyone here. Has anyone here been on Odyssey in the past couple of days? Odyssey is fucking tiny compared to YouTube. And the layout of Odyssey looks great now. I mean, Odyssey, like, I would say, like, objectively, just from a kind of a UI point of view, looks better than YouTube. And, you know, the videos load fine, it runs fine, it looks good. You don't have to do any, like, you don't have to do any of the play along with the YouTube algorithm crap. It's fantastic. And Odyssey is run on on a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the people that are running it. So even though you've got all these people who are kicked out of the system, you've got a big group of these disparate, highly talented people who are now outside the system and who don't like you because you've kicked them out. I mean, and this ends up driving people more and more against the system or against the regime. I mean, again, don't kind of misquote me, but I was talking about Ewan McKenna earlier. Ewan McKenna a couple of days ago was, no, I mean, like he's not like a nationalist, obviously, but the guy was tweeting and supporting remarks that fucking Tucker Carlson made. That's how far McKenna has changed over the past like few months, and one of the reasons a part of that is because of the fact that he just went, well, I don't think people should be forcibly, you know, jabbed, and I think lockdowns are a bit much, and the all these journalists they just they just throw the guy under a bus. So, and that's going to lead to another effect too, because I think with a lot of these with a lot of the kind of high up corporate types or with a lot of high up civil servant types, that effect is more rooted. But the problem then, or the big weakness that they have, is journalists and journalism and the media. And we're seeing this especially with Joe Rogan, because again, you don't have to like these people, or you don't have to, you know, trust them or completely agree with them or anything like that. I mean, I definitely don't. But there is, for me anyway, there's no kind of doubt that like those two Joe Rogan podcasts, the Joe Rogan Peter McCullough one and the Robert Malone one, definitely did change the mood or the sentiment. I mean, you had a guy like the world's biggest podcaster, and he's talking about to Robert Malone about how the vaccine is not great, and he's openly talking about how the system then ends up in a social credit system right at the end of the talk. That's where that's where things are kind of headed. So, and in just even in relation to that, you have these kind of like media types who are looking at this, and they still have to make money. Journalists, you know, they don't want to learn to code, and they they still have to kind of appeal to people like that. So that's those two corresponding forces: the fact that you have this compliance system which is kicking people out, and this non-compliant system which is keeping people in. Sorry, these non-compliant creative people who actively don't like your system, even though the latter don't have the resources that the first group have. A lot of the times they often have that kind of level of competence or expertise or skill to do an awful lot with very, very little. I mean, another example I can think of there is, I don't know if any of you saw this, but when Justin Trudeau fled Ottawa, some random lad on Pole or managed to find out where the guy was actually like hiding out based on a couple of background images on a wall and some cloud patterns. I mean, that's absolutely insane, isn't it? Like the amount of skill you need to do that. And that guy is, probably, I don't know, is he just kind of like stuck in his mom's basement or whatever? But so you have these two different components as well. And finally, there's another one that I've noticed as well among the elite, and it's not just the kind of the philosophy of it and the power of it and all of that. It's the fact that, and I don't know if you've seen it as well, but a lot of these kind of middle class to upper class people, or a lot of these elites, they tend to be more simply mentally ill on average. They tend to be suffering or afflicted with these kind of mental mental illnesses and mental disorders and all of that kind of thing. And it it kind of makes sense because what you're doing or what you've done is you've like whether it's in a corporate environment or whether it's in like a public office environment, if you're bringing up people into, say, roles or leadership positions that they shouldn't be in, like, I mean, one of the interesting things I've seen is like this, people talking about like, do you suffer from imposter syndrome? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, if imposter syndrome is being talked about more and more, maybe it's because they feel that they're in a place that, maybe in a place of management or in a place of responsibility that they they shouldn't be in. So it's it's just going to kind of like continue on and spiral from there. And if you've got these different organizations whereby you've got these like increasingly people who are kind of mentally ill or maybe even not mentally ill but just like not in places that they should be, then the performance of a lot of companies, the performance of a lot of structures ends up breaking down and becomes more and more inefficient. And then you have people who are left outside the system who can make that up or who can back that up. Jimmy Hagan says it was Trudeau's stepbrother led his location leak on that infamous interview done recently. Even told people there were two entrances. Oh, okay. Oh, cool. I didn't. Okay, I didn't know that. I thought it was like a. I thought it was maybe that happened at the same time, or maybe that was wrong. But I thought that like a lad in one of the chans ended up like finding out where he was. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. Oh yeah, there's something about like a stepbrother not liking him and all that kind of thing too. So, but yeah, so with all of that, with all of those kind of like different points, I've probably been a bit more rambly. This has probably been a bit more unstructured than I would have liked to have been. Where does that leave us, and where does that leave Ireland, Irish politics beyond the inevitable issues that are going forward? Well, let's just talk about that for a bit. So there's going to be the inflation problem, right? The problem is when with dealing with inflation is tools that you would have to deal with inflation, we don't really have anymore. We gave away our monetary policy tools, manipulating interest rates to the ECB. We struck down, whether it's LNG terminals that we refuse to build in Shannon, or whether it's peat production, forget production for the Mona, all that kind of thing. We've shut down a big chunk of our ability to make energy because Eamon Ryan, likes climate change, wants all that kind of thing to go forward. So we've shut all that down. We've injected people with a vaccine that is damaging people, and that's causing a massive increase in insurance costs and insurance premiums. So there's that going on as well. I mean, that's actually a funny one. The Irish Times had an article, and I posted a couple of clips of it there. Let me see if I can just find it there for you. So I just wanted to read the start of it. So hospitals under pressure as number of older and sicker patients seeking care surges. HSE says some appointments cancelled as number of over 75s presenting to EDs 45% up on last year. Well, 45% up. 45% up. See, we get rid of all the lockdowns and everything's over and everything's free, but we have the most amount of people using emergency health services ever recorded in the history of the state, and over 75s are up in hospital by 45%. Yeah, that's going to lead to more cost issues. That's going to lead to more health issues. That's going to lead to more infrastructural issues. So we've done all this. And the response is going to be, let's just throw everyone a big sack of money. It's not going to work. Just like there is going to be no proper solution to the housing issue because no one wants to go near the demand side because people don't want to be called racist for talking about an iron rule or iron law of economics. But there's more to it than that as well. So those issues are going to increase further and further and further. And then you end up getting Sinn Féin. That's, I mentioned them earlier, and I want to talk about this because on four mentioned this. He sent a very good 3-minute voice clip there. If you want to listen to it in the comment section of this, it's right at the start. He was talking about the fact that, and I agree with him, that the mistake in terms of the stability of the government have made is going with this carbon tax thing. So what Sinn Féin are going to do is they're going to keep hammering the whole carbon tax thing. They're going to keep going like, what are you doing? And it's kind of a safe thing for them to do because like they can just go down the line of what are you doing? People, inflation is up. We can bring this stuff in later, or we can bring this in on a staggered basis, or we can bring it into everyone who is on an income of 100,000 or over. You don't need to do this. And the government are stuck, and the government can't back down for 2 reasons. Number one, because they don't want it to look bad. And number two, because of this, this sort of ideological obsession. We've got the right philosophy. We believe the science. We're a part of dealing with climate change. And so with those, they're not going to back down. And it's just going to be a very easy, thing for Sinn Féin to pick away at. And as the inflation gets worse, and as these issues get worse, and as anger builds and builds and builds, you're going to see things like, Sinn Féin marches, Sinn Féin protests about things like the carbon tax. Because the thing is with Sinn Féin, and I'm going to use maybe a quick music example or music comparison here, is I don't know if there's an exact name for it. Maybe someone can help me out there in the chat. I would call it like acceptable rebellion or acceptable edginess. So what I mean by that is, I'll use maybe a music example. Why was Nevermind by Nirvana so popular? They were kind of, edgy in 1991, kind of more edgy out there for kind of a mainstream act. But at the same time, like Nirvana were essentially like a pop band. They wrote in it catchy, depending on if you like them or not, kind of radio-friendly songs. And Sinn Féin, that's the place you want to be in, that kind of acceptable edginess. Sinn Féin are kind of in that place bit right now where you can kind of like say to, or a lot of normal people can say to like others, oh yeah, I'm a Sinn Féin voter. I'm a nationalist in the Sinn Féin sense. And they won't get ostracized. They won't get alienated from what's going on by saying that. But they'll feel kind of good, or they'll feel kind of like, they're a step ahead, or they're out there, or they're edgy. And I think if you can get into that place consistently, if you can get into that box, that acceptable rebelliousness, or whatever you want to call it, I know that's a terrible term, but you know what I mean there, then you're in a very good place for an awful lot of voters, especially within the confines of a scenario that is rapidly changing. And even back to the music example, why are Nirvana popular? Because of that mix of like, they're essentially like a catchy pop band, but they had the kind of, edgy, kind of half gay, nihilistic run stuff. Even a better example actually might be Metallica. So like a lot of normal people like and listen to Metallica, and one of the reasons why is that Metallica, Nothing Else Matters, they've got good kind of catchy songs like that, but no one is, how many fucking people are going to listen to Burzum or Gorguts or any of these kind of bands? And the answer is fuck all people. And there is a point to this, like, don't worry. And it kind of goes back to the kind of politics stuff. You know, you can be kind of that little bit um sort of like edgy but acceptable, like a Metallica with a lot of normal people. But if you're kind of like, no one is going to listen to, or the vast majority of people are not going to become big Gorguts fans or Meshuggah fans because that's just too out there. And it just goes back into talking to stuff like this, because even I see on forums there as well, um, like the reality is with a lot of these with a lot of these opinions and with a lot of these is that you need to kind of express them in a kind of palatable way, and I just kind of like, like when I see people talk about the virus or the vaccine or that kind of thing, like especially within an Irish context, if you're trying to kind of get people on your side, and you start going on about, like, the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and all that kind of thing. I'm not saying that's not true, but it just goes back to the kind of music example I was being earlier. Like, there's a way to make it like you can say these things, and I've this has been my experience a lot. Like, you can say these things, but you have to say them in a certain way, and you have to present them in a certain way. And if you do so, like 90% of people, will agree with you. But if you say them in the wrong kind of manner or in the wrong kind of way, you will, yeah, you will kind of get yourself alienated. So that was a bit of a sidestep, but basically the main thing, what I think is going to happen is the inflation costs are going to get worse. The carbon tax is going to be a big thing. Sinn Féin are going to be prodding or pushing on that pressure more and more and more as the months go on. And meanwhile, within the other two parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, what's coming up in December is, well, there's a few things going to come up towards the end of the year. One thing that's going to come up in December is the changeover from Varadkar, sorry, from Martin to Varadkar. And that is going to be like, because the thing is, like, Martin is just going to give into that completely. And that, combined with the increased amount of pressure that's going to build up as a result of the various policies, of various economic policies, of the carbon tax stuff, is going to make people very, very, very angry. And now we're getting into the absolutely bizarre clown world scenario whereby people are talking about, like, you know, have you had your AIDS test? This is how much. I mean, I predicted this. I talked about this in the last stream, but I've been talking about this for months and months and months now with the whole ADE thing, about how this thing fucking knackers your immune system. That's going to start coming more and more to the front as well. And the outcome of that would be, or could be, some very, very, very angry people. And so if that ends up at a particular point, you are going to see the Fianna Fáil senior members and senior council members increasingly go against Martin. That's not going to happen in Fine Gael. They have a more kind of regime or disciplined response to all of this. But Martin doesn't, because the consensus within the Fianna Fáil party is that Martin essentially took the whole thing to be Taoiseach. And a lot of guys, as this thing continues to crash and burn, are just going to want to step up and just absolutely walk away from this entire thing. And so that pressure is going to build up more and more as the year goes on. If there is going to be a collapse in the government, it's not going to come from the Green Party. It's not going to come from Fine Gael. It's going to come from the senior members of Fianna Fáil if they kind of get kind of things together quickly enough. And yeah, just one more thing as well. I think like I've been going on for about an hour here, so I might wrap it up after this. The reason you're seeing, I think everyone's had like it's fun with that. I think everyone has kind of seen like the stuff like exercising can result in heart attacks. Smoking weed can result in heart attacks. Eating meat can result in heart attacks. Alarm clocks can result in heart attacks. You know this kind of stuff that's been cropping up more and more and more to explain what's happened since the vaccines have been rolled out. That's an example of the kind of compliance stuff I was talking about before. That like if you've got this group of people who are compliant and who are not able to think about what is going on kind of outside their own perception, basically, they come up with these absolutely ludicrous clown show explanations. So that kind of level of surrealness is just going to continue more and more and more. So yeah, it's interesting times. You're going to see shocks which might have happened like 10, 15 years ago, and they would have been kind of like something horrible or relatively minor things. But storms are going to turn into climate change. Murders are going to turn into all Irishmen are awful. These big hysterical events, and then the compliance system that we have, you're going to have more and more people complying with the most kind of ridiculous manner and the most ridiculous rules and laws. And the more non-compliant people are going to be kicked out, the more compliant people are going to be stuck in, and then the system is just going to end up more and more kind of freezing on the top until that level of decision making basically deteriorates. And we're even seeing that with the Ukraine, the whole Russia-Ukraine thing. That it's the whole kind of like bad Russia, good good US, good United States. But also, but the funny thing of that, and that's also another banner there, because is that like Russia supplies 40% of Europe's gas, and although we actually don't get a big chunk of that gas, but the problem is we do get a big chunk, as far as I know, of Norwegian gas and Denmark gas. So if Russia goes down, then the cost of gas in that region will go up, and then yeah, we're in enormous trouble. So it's going to be certainly going to be a very, very, very interesting set of months coming up and set of weeks coming up, especially even with the fact that the ECB and a couple of these the Feds, they're going to raise interest rates, I think, and what I think they're going to do is they're going to try, and so if they keep things going right now, you're just going to have like just inflation like crazy. They raise interest rates too sharply. This is their thinking, by the way. You're going to have like a massive default and a deflationary spiral. So they're going to try and stagger it out. They're going to try and stagger it out by just making marginal increases, and they're going to do it over the next quarters or the preceding quarters. So that will be interesting, or that will be something to look out for as well. So yeah, I think that's it. I think that was a bit more rambly than I would have liked it to have been, but it's just basically a way of like, why did we end up in this position whereby we have people like Eamon Ryan in charge of telling people to grow lettuce on the windowsill, or why is it that we have Luke O'Neill telling people to leave the window open so that their elderly grandparents, freeze. How did we end up with these kind of people making these kind of decisions? And the reason being is that our system, that way we pick elites, chooses for compliance over other things. And the reason it chooses for compliance rather than other things is because of the increase of public safety, the increase in transport, in particular the airline deregulation of the airline industry. So you end up with more immigrants and more women in your companies, in your organizations, and in general, those people, for various reasons, are going to want everything to be more compliant, to be more like everyone, to get along, essentially. And once you end up with that, you end up kicking a lot of people out of the system, and content creative skilled people a lot of times are not found within these systems anymore. And so the wrong decisions keep getting made again and again and again, and then things end up going to shit. Okay, well, that's it anyway. So thanks for listening. I think I'll cut it off there. Yeah, I think I'll cut it off there. I think I've been going for more than an hour at this stage. So yeah, with that, so how many people are there? Oh, cool, 28. That's really cool. That's really cool. Thank you very much. Have a good Saturday. Have a good rest of your weekend, and I will speak to you later on. And yeah, I've recorded this, so I'll just post a link to it after we're done here. So cool. Have a good one, and I'll speak to you later. Cool. No, bye. Bye-bye.